it's a journey from Congo that takes several days to get here. And so I had the time to really think about and worry about why I'm here. I gave up science, I think 30 years ago, to take on park management. I gave up science because my brain shrank in my late 20s. And so it's quite humbling to be in your company. And so during that recent journey coming from Congo, I spent a bit of time trying to work on the linkages that bring me here. And what sprang to mind, and it just finally surfaced in a discussion I had barely a minute ago with John, is that where I've come from is an extraordinarily beautiful site called Ishango, which is where we were forced to settle late last year because of the rebellion. We've had a succession of headquarters to try and run the park. We've had 4 in the last 2 years. Each time we've been pushed out by the armed conflict and have had to move as refugees to new areas. And the latest one is this extraordinarily beautiful site called Ishango. And it's actually somewhere where I feel incredibly happy because it's a very safe place amidst the horrors of Eastern Congo. It's somewhere where we've been able to settle. But it's also a site where 70 years ago, I think it's Franz Boas, but an archaeologist discovered a fossilized baboon bone with markings on it, which is now referred to as the Ishango bone, and is believed to be the first signs of mathematical thought in the archaeological record. And so what we bring in Ishango are the origins of science. What you bring, of course, is the future of science in this extraordinary center. And in between is this incredible journey that takes us to where we are today, this journey of humanity, which one would have thought, when you look at the extraordinary achievements of science, would have made society a better construct. And of course, we're all faced with great concern about the future at the moment. I think we all feel that we're in a period of very worrying disruption. Things are not going to plan. And those are periods which require the kind of reflection that comes with that level of stress. These are things that we've been living with for 30 years now in Congo. I arrived in 1993. The following year, we lived the horrors of the Rwandan genocide, and then a succession of horrific wars. We're now living our 5th war since I arrived in Congo, and between 5 and 8 million Congolese have died in the most awful of circumstances as a result of those conflicts. And in living through that, we've been doing our own science in the best way we can to try and understand that. And that's really what I wanted to present today, in the hope of just igniting some discussion with people who have the ability to think far further than we can, because we're in the thick of it. And so I very much hope, and I really welcome the invitation to develop this discussion. So Virunga, what brings us is this idea of a corridor across the heart of the Congo Basin, but at the origins of that is this absolutely extraordinary site on the eastern periphery of the Congo Basin, the backbone of the Albertine Rift, which is the mountainous spine, one could say, of the Western Rift Valley. Because it's so mountainous, because it has such extraordinary landscape diversity, the species that have developed follow suit, and it's become probably the region in the world with the greatest number of bird, mammal, reptile, amphibian, and also plant species. It's an area of unbelievable diversity. And then all along that backbone of the Albertine Rift is this national park, which is Africa's first national park. We celebrate our 100th anniversary on the 21st of April. So it's a big moment for us. It's also a national park that, in terms of its extraordinary biodiversity, which goes from the top of the Ruwenzori Mountains, the Ptolemy's mythical mountains of the moon, the true source of the Nile, as we agreed earlier, is then followed by this journey through the moorlands, the alpine forests, and down into the tropical moist forests of the Congo Basin, and then these extraordinary savannas, wetlands, and lakes, and extends ultimately to, in the southern part, right down into the very heart of the Earth itself, with the most active volcanoes imaginable. And so if, as I was as a child, you're fascinated by the natural world, you will invariably be drawn to this extraordinary site, which is that's Nyamulagira, which is right next to Nyiragongo. Yeah, exactly. Which is the most active volcano in the world at the moment. It erupts every 2 to 3 years. And so, whilst it's an extraordinarily beautiful site that had it classed as Africa's first natural World Heritage Site by UNESCO, it's also an epicenter of horrific violence, as I was saying earlier. So it's it's an area that experienced now 30 years of civil war, and I think the key point that I would like to make is that every single one of those wars began either in or around Virunga National Park. And these are wars that stain our generation. They're wars that represent a level of human suffering which can only be considered all of our problems, but most people don't even know about it. And so that only, of course, makes it worse. But when one experiences suffering at that level, it becomes the dominant issue. So every aspect of our work, be it conservation, be it development, be it business, whatever it is, has to ultimately lead to one objective, which is addressing this issue of violence, of extreme violence. And of course, it's something that we've experienced very directly. I arrived 30 years ago. The people I worked with are what kept me in Virunga more than anything else. 211 of my colleagues, my friends, have been killed in the effort to continue the work to protect this extraordinary national park, a national park that's an integral part of world heritage. It belongs to all of us. We're all the beneficiaries of this incredible biodiversity. But there are people on the ground who are really paying the price of preserving that. And of course, it has an extraordinary cost on the wildlife as well. And this was a moment we lived in 2007 when the war really extended into the guerrilla sector, the area that you, John, visited in 1976, when it was at the height of its extraordinary wealth in with this extraordinary species that is the mountain gorillas. In 2007, we were suddenly faced with a whole series of attacks on the mountain gorillas, to the point that they were being killed at an incredible and increasing rate, and we just didn't know why. And that really was the moment when we came to realize that my whole training as a conservationist amounted to nothing. It was failing. If we couldn't even protect the most emblematic species of this region, something was going badly wrong. And so it brought about over a year of just real reflection, of investigation into what was going on, why were they killing the mountain gorillas, and what was happening. And really what helped us more than anything else to understand what was happening was this picture, which was taken by a good friend. And it's a very simple, very disturbing picture, but it contains everything you need to know about the underlying dynamics of violence and resources, and the interaction between the two. And it's what helped us to work out the problem. And of course, it's a very emotional picture. It really hurts to see a picture like that. And sometimes it is that emotion that helps you to rationalize these problems. The man with the rifle is one of our staff. He's a good person, but in this image, he looks like the offender. He looks like the thug, and there are clearly victims who are these women who are pleading, and they're pleading to access the park to collect fuel wood. It's not a lot to ask to collect fuel wood so that you can prepare food, boil your water for the health of your family and your children. But the laws prevent him from allowing them in, and it creates an extraordinary level of tension, and really captures this issue that we have these resources across the planet. They're protected because they're there for humanity. They're there for you and I. And we're the ones who benefit, but there is also a cost. And that cost is being borne by the local community, as you can see in this image. Virunga National Park, as in so many other parks and resources across the world, but Virunga represents almost 1 million hectares, 800,000 hectares of land. That land will generate $1,400 on average per year for a Congolese family living around the park. These are some of the poorest people on earth, so that that park can be protected, so that we can enjoy the elephants and the gorillas. They have to forfeit 800,000 hectares times $1,400. That's over $1 billion of lost revenue for what are effectively some of the poorest people on earth. You will not find a more poignant case for social injustice than that. And of course, when you have injustice on that scale, where people are dying because they can't access their resources, invariably you get violence, and you start to understand the relationship between resources and violence. And so we started looking into it, and really, I'll be brief because it does contain a lot of detail. But essentially, when you're faced with extreme violence, and you start to look at it from the perspective of people on the ground, you start to identify the ingredients of armed conflict. And I would say, in our experience of living and working and sharing with people who live around the park, and there are 11 million of them who live within a day's walk of this national park. The real issues, the basic ingredients are the issue of where resources go and how they're captured, the power relations around them, and when they fall into the illegal sector, they create revenue streams, and those revenue streams fuel private armies. And that's really the first ingredient, is illegal financing for what we would call armed groups. And that's critically important. The next is, because of that, you get a gradual weakening of public institutions, the weakening of the state, the erosion through all sorts of mechanisms that can broadly be captured under one word, which is the word corruption, which is what erodes the authority of the state. And the breakdown of governance, good governance over natural resources, invariably leads to the breakdown of public institutions, which is the second ingredient. And then the third, of course, is the one that was captured by the earlier image, which is the breakdown of trust between the state and the populations that the state is there to serve. And when those three issues come together, you get onto a pathway towards violence, towards armed conflict, towards civil war, which is the ultimate breakdown of society. What we found is that those ingredients are very explicitly identifiable in Virunga National Park. And when you start to identify those, if you see the issue of forest destruction for charcoal, because the laws are not respected, the armed groups come in, they control the illegal trafficking of charcoal, mainly for the city of Goma, 2 million people, $45 million generated from charcoal. With that, you can finance an army, you can finance a war, and suddenly it all starts to make sense. Illegal fishing on Lake Edward, $62 million. 80% of that is illegal. It's trafficking of, it's illegal fishing. Again, controlled by the armed groups. Another example I like to give, because it became quite personal, is the issue of illegal oil. When a British company, a listed company on the London Stock Exchange, came to Virunga and chose to break the law of the land to illegally enter the park to explore with a view to exploiting oil in the national park, the first thing they started to do, because it's illegal, was to pay off government officials, our own staff. Of course, they oversaw the fact that a Congolese public servant isn't systematically corrupt. That was their big mistake. And they reported it immediately, and that was their downfall. But they also paid the FDLR, the Mai Mai militias, as a way of securing their staff to enter the park. And so again, you get the two basic ingredients: corrupting state institutions and creating a new revenue stream for private armies, for armed militias. And so just as illegal fishermen will corrupt government officials, and these are people living in close to the poverty line, you'll get exactly the same process going on with a listed company on the London Stock Exchange. They're doing exactly the same thing. So they had we gave them a pretty rough time. Yeah. I mean, we upheld the law, and that was a problem for them. Their share value went from £3.5 billion down to 300 million, and they changed their name to, I forget what it's called. It doesn't really matter anymore. But they eventually left Virunga. But what's important is, if there are these underlying resource dynamics that lead to violence, can you find an alternative that goes in the opposite direction? And during those years of reflection after the gorilla killings, we came to realize that, if we were to really have impact as conservationists, we had to compete with an illegal trafficking industry that was worth $170 million a year. So that's the charcoal, the illegal fishing, land invasions, smuggling of commodities through the park, and so on. And that's something that we as conservationists are just not equipped with. And so we started looking to other fields. This is why Gaia and people like her are on board. We stopped hiring conservationists and started hiring managers, engineers, business-minded people, and so on, to try and build an alternate conservation model for Virunga. And of course, what we quickly discovered was that there was an incredible wealth of resources that could equally be developed in a way that harnesses peace instead of violence. And the first of these was energy, clean energy, renewable energy. It's a high rainfall park that's also very mountainous. It's rivers, its streams build into rivers that build into torrents that are very high in energy, which can be, of course, converted into electricity. Fisheries could be developed sustainably, and the extraordinary potential of the human population, coupled with the incredibly fertile lands. If the whole Congolese economy could be transformed from an extractive landscape to one where transformation occurs within, then you could create wealth in the formal sector, in the legal sector, in the sector that contributes to society, that creates quality jobs, and so on. And then, of course, tourism, which opens the region up to the kind of financing that could perhaps develop that. And of course, the greatest resource of all, which are its people. This is Shamavu, who's one of our rangers, who 10 years ago went into a community that was controlled by the Mai Mai. He went in unarmed and recovered this little fellow who's also called Shamavu after him, and talked his way into recovering that gorilla, really risked his life, brought him back to Rumangabo. And now, after 10 years, he's being released back into the wild. And it's a real moment for us. We brought a group of them back into the wild last October, and they're doing incredibly well. They're part of a recovery process for the lowland gorillas of Virunga. And it's really the key thing is that when you have a community of people around you who bring, because we can talk about numbers, we can talk about business models all day long, but at the end of the day, if you have people who are prepared to do that, who are prepared to push that hard to make it work, then you have everything you need to succeed with these kinds of models. And so what we did is we built an energy company as a social enterprise, and it became vertically integrated. We did everything. We trained up over the years Congolese engineers who built the power plants, electrical engineers who build the networks and the power distribution grids in the cities, and it's become the second biggest energy company in Congo. It contributes 80% of the electricity to the city of Goma, a city of 2 million people, and it funds most of the national park's operating costs today. Of course, it operates in an incredibly challenging environment. We're supplying electricity to the city of Goma. When the electricity lines go down, the pumping stations stop delivering water to the 2 million people in Goma. Within 48 hours, you get cholera epidemics. In 94, 95, 1,000 people a day were dying of waterborne diseases because the pumping station stopped. And so we built, with these these Congolese engineers an incredible system, which is, and its energy supply in wartime is one of the most key elements for the dynamics of that war. What did Russia do in attacking Ukraine? It attacked its energy infrastructure. What was the first thing Israel did in entering Gaza? Cut off the electricity supply. Same thing with Goma. First thing that was done was the power lines were bombed. So we built a second redundant power line in case the first was bombed. Of course, that one got bombed as well. And so we built bridging lines between the two power lines so that we could slalom from one power line to the other to avoid the areas, to bypass the areas that were bombed. And that way we were able to avoid a power loss to the city and the tens of thousands of people who would have died in the city of Goma. And that's really how it's done. It's not that clever. You just need to think fast when it's happening. And this is something that, the Congolese are so good at, is that resilience. And then the second aspect second key thing is agriculture, of course, because agriculture is the life support system for 100 million Congolese, and of course the 11 million around Virunga. And it's also, just because it's so important, it also has this flip side, which is that it's equally a source of extraordinary violence. And the one I will mention, so we work across a whole number of value chains. The one that's one of the most interesting is cocoa. Cocoa is a commodity that we all love. Everyone likes chocolate. But in Eastern Congo, it's a cause of enormous suffering. It's the main revenue stream for the ADF militias, who are a jihadist group from that were at the heart of Idi Amin's army in the early 80s, moved across to Congo when the rule of law was restored in Uganda, and were actually for many years, looking to integrate the Congolese population and weren't seeking violence. But then some strategic mistakes were made by the UN and by the DRC government in 2015, and it really weaponized the ADF, and they became very violent. But one of the things that they became violent over was controlling the cocoa trade. And in fact, a lot of the cocoa that you probably eat or drink is smuggled by the ADF. So they'll go into a community, they'll kill people just before the harvest. The community will flee and they'll pillage the harvest and then smuggle it across to Uganda and sell it as probably fair trade cocoa in Uganda as Ugandan, and shall be sold to large cocoa traders who will be supplying the European market with this cocoa certified as Ugandan cocoa. And this is going on, and you'll see large multinationals who've put their warehouses on the Congo border because that's where all the cocoa is coming from. But they perhaps believe that it's Ugandan cocoa. And so that's a huge problem. And so the approach has been, how do we work on those value chains in a way, much like with the energy, and I perhaps didn't explain that very well. I'll come back to it. We've got two very violent militia groups, the FDLR, who are the genocide perpetrators of the horrors that happened in Rwanda in 1994. They moved into Congo and have since been the cause of extreme violence in Congo. Their main revenue stream is charcoal. It's controlling the forest, the cutting down of the forest, 92% of it in the national park, and generating about $45 million a year. And that's what's kept them going for 30 years since those horrific events in Rwanda. The alternative revenue stream, the alternative value chain to that is clean energy. And so right now with the European Union, we've been able to build the infrastructure. It's there. And now it's a question of putting e-cookers and induction stoves into the city of Goma at a massive rate, which actually saves a poor household $6 a month, because clean electricity is cheaper than illegal charcoal. So it provides that alternative option. With respect to cocoa, we were at the height of those massacres in 2021. It was our community. We were living in that area. Between January and March, there were 6 attacks on the community around us. About 120 people were killed. So we went to the community. We held a whole number of public rallies, discussions over how to handle this with those that have remained. About 60% of the population fled to the town of Beni. And we talked about this idea of reorganizing the whole cocoa value chain. But what they said is we can't do anything without security, and the army is part of the problem. And that's true. It's not just the militias who are looting the cocoa, it's also the army. So you get this breakdown. This is the whole notion of corruption, the breakdown of trust with government institutions. So what we suggested was, let's rein in the army, let's build them proper accommodation, proper barracks, close off those barracks, and turn the system around. We put panic buttons throughout the community, and it was the community that calls out the army. The rest of the time, they stay in their barracks. So we bought them television, we gave them rations, medical supplies, what they needed to stay put. Whereas 120 people were killed in those 3 months leading to these events, when we discussed this idea with them, we developed a plan to build out the barracks and place the army. We reckoned it would take 6 weeks to build it. About 4,000 people came from the community, and we built the whole thing in 24 hours. The ADF attacked us that night and killed 3 of our staff. But since then, there hasn't been a single victim since April 2021 in that community. And those 60% of the people who fled have returned. And it's become an extraordinary town with a whole industrialization. I'll come on to that briefly. But what we then did was to build around that industrial parks that really build out a whole new value chain with those 4 segments in that chain. The agricultural production with the community, working out ways to regenerate that, to increase yields and increase the value of those yields, the unit value of those yields. And that was done by industrializing through to the second level, which is a first level of industry. In this case, a palm oil industrial press in the community. The revenues from that fund the security of that community, and dividends go back to the community. And then eventually a much more elaborate system, and I'll explain why I'm showing this, but what we call these forward operating bases, FOBs, that have a security infrastructure with the army and the rangers that will deploy to protect the community around. It's not yet built, but a solar farm providing energy to the town, and then a cocoa fermentation center so that people no longer have to ferment in their field. They no longer need to dry the cocoa in their field. It'll go straight to there, and in a safe environment, create a legal, safe value chain for the cocoa, and likewise for the palm nuts. And then through to a secondary transformation, which is really to create value. The great tragedy of Congo, right all the way back to the Congo Free State and the colony, is that it's only ever been used for extraction. And transformation has never occurred within the country. And so when a people lose control of their resources, they lose control of their future. And so the real challenge is to bring that transformation back to the Congolese people. But for that, you need a certain number of intrants, of inputs. And one of them is energy. Another one is the financial services that make it possible. So there's a whole other story that Gaia is working on, of a joint venture that we've done with the Grameen Bank, to make financial services available to entrepreneurs in Congo through the electricity network. And that's really the innovation, is that people can use their smart meters in their homes as the front office of a bank. And it makes, and what we've seen is this enormous growth of transformation industry. This is the wheat and the biscuit and the bread, the industrial bakeries around the town of Lubero, which is actually right on the front line of the current conflict. But they're continuing to build it because, the big thing about Congo is that we have a war every 5 years. To build peace, and we're convinced of that, it takes a lot longer. It takes 20, 25 years. It's a generational challenge. And so if you wait for all the conditions to appear, you can never break out of that cycle of violence. And so this goes back to the picture of Shamavu and the gorilla. You have to have the courage to build the peace during periods of war. If you use that mindset of no, les conditions ne sont pas réunies, and the conditions are not there, then you never break out of that cycle of violence, and that's a problem. But we have a level of industry that's coming in that's absolutely world class. The ladies that you see in these pictures are the wives of rangers who've been killed, who've taken up the profession of world-class chocolatiers, and we're producing that chocolate. This is our 100-year commemorative limited edition. I'm not supposed to sell chocolate, am I? But it's available online. It's the Easter edition of Virunga's chocolate, which they've made, and we were able to secure the best of Congolese cocoa because we're there at source. But importantly, every gram that goes into this chocolate can be sourced back to the individual farmer that produced it. And what we have in line, this is really thanks to the extraordinary commitment that the European Union has given since 1988. We have, I think, the longest living relationship for any program that the European Union has ever done. And it's slowly and steadily increased over the years. And this is part of the issue, is that if you're in a 3-year cycle, you're never gonna cut it. You need that long-term commitment, which the European Union has given us, to be able to achieve these results. And the fact that we can, source it back to the individual farmer also makes it compliant with, these incredible demands that the European market is imposing in terms of, the deforestation regulations and so on, which are a good thing, but it all amounts to a positive feedback mechanism for this. And so what we found was that these value chains, these alternative value chains, are growing incredibly fast, and were taking us towards a tipping point between the economy of war and the economy of peace. And that's really where the science comes in, is how do you measure that? And how do you know where you are on that continuum? And when do you know, how do you know, what's your target to try and get to that tipping point? Because the implications are just so vast. It's the future of millions of people. And so, the news that something was happening at the heart of the civil war, of the violence in Eastern Congo, something really weird was going on, eventually, of course, reached Kinshasa, and President Tshisekedi sent a team in October last year to try and work out what was happening. And this team had one individual within it who is an extraordinarily dynamic businessman who became an advisor to the president, who really understood it all, but had an amazing capacity to make things move in terms of legislation and institutional change in Kinshasa. It's something which to me sounds near impossible, and he just had this amazing aptitude to make it happen. He went back to Kinshasa, explained what was going on. Within 3 days, the Conseil des Ministres, the cabinet of the head of state, brought it in as a main priority for the government, and instructed us to prepare the laws to make this whole approach, how conservation should be done in Congo. On the 15th of the 15th of December, Parliament was instructed to debate this as an amendment to the law. We were only able to get them the legal texts and all the background research on it on the Friday. If we were unable to get it voted by Sunday night, Parliament went into recess. And so Parliament, both the lower house and the Senate, were instructed to work through the whole weekend to get this enacted into law. And it was passed just before midnight on Sunday the 15th of December. And then it was taken to the Prime Minister and passed as a Prime Minister's decree, creating this new idea, which was to expand this conservation model across a corridor that went all the way through the Ituri to Kisangani and all the way down the Congo River to Kinshasa. So I'll just say a couple of words about that. What really drew attention to that was that the Chinese Belts and Roads Initiative, we discovered less than a year ago, we're starting to build the road between Kisangani and Virunga. This is a road that cuts through the Ituri, which is the largest untouched tropical forest mass left on Earth. It's an extraordinary expanse of forest. It's also extremely fragile. Cutting a road through the middle of it carries all sorts of implications. Now, of course, Congo needs roads to develop. The Belts and Roads Initiative is an important initiative for Congo, but it's potentially incredibly destructive if the mitigation measures are not taken seriously. Already, people are beginning to develop secondary roads, feeder roads, and the tributaries to the Congo River. So that 800 kilometers of roads takes you to the upper end of the navigable part of the Congo River. You've then got all the tributaries. You have a perfect design for the fragmentation of the Congo Basin, probably within 10 years. It'll lose its ecosystem function. It'll lose its climatic function. And so the stakes are enormous. And I would say the Congolese government were acutely aware of that responsibility, but also of the other threats, the idea that because of an unchecked economic development from the war-torn east along this corridor, the potential that actually the violence spreads westwards as well. So there are all these risks. And so that really nurtured this idea that the concept of what we call the Virunga Alliance, this idea of using a natural ecosystem as an instrument for reducing poverty and for reducing violence, could be expanded all the way across the Congo Basin along this corridor started to take shape, and of course came into law just before the World Economic Forum, where it was announced by the president 2-3 months ago. And so that's really where we are now. We have this incredible opportunity to do something that is of consequence to the whole of humanity. You know, looking at this corridor in detail, you know, what does it mean? Can we actually do something with this corridor in the same way as what we did in Virunga? And what we find is that, of course, Virunga and the Kivus are part of the corridor. You've got a concentration of population and a concentration of problems in the east, certainly. But you have 6 large cities, Goma, Butembo, Beni, Kisangani, Mbandaka, and Kinshasa, the biggest city in Africa. I think it's, you were saying, one of the biggest cities in the world in the next... One of the 3 biggest cities in the world in the next 10 years, 30 years. So the significance of it is enormous. But we did an analysis of the demography of the corridor. There are 116 towns around those big cities, and 31 million people. It's an area the size of, more or less the size of France. It's the biggest nature reserve, terrestrial nature reserve on Earth. But those figures are really important because we work with cities. We don't work so much with the rest because you know, it's the cities that contain the vast majority of the human population, and you have to make cities livable for the rest of the planet to function. And so, you know, bringing basic services to those cities means, you know, developing the energy networks and the commodity chains, the value chains that feed those cities. It's not that overwhelming. If you were to bring electricity to the 116 cities, towns rather, the rural towns, the market towns, it costs about $300,000 per town on average. There's a town between 10 and 100,000 people. You're talking about $30 to $40 million to achieve that. If you want to supply large-scale electricity to the cities like Kisangani and Mbandaka, it's anything between 50 and 100 million. Yeah, those are big sums, but they're not that big if you're considering, you know, perhaps the most critical asset, or certainly one of the most critical assets in terms of addressing the climate crisis. Not to mention the issue that these are instruments that nurture peace in an area that so desperately needs it. What's important as well, of course, is that these are business models. They're not, you know, they're not, in French you say un feu de paille. They break even after 2 years, and are self-sustaining, including the security infrastructure. Now, the UN spends $1.2 billion on the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo. That represents, you know, over the last 25 years, upwards of $30 billion for a peacekeeping effort that, you know, has delivered, you know, debatable results, let's say. From an agricultural perspective, you've got this extraordinary potential. I won't talk about it too much, but it offers really the basis for a viable business case to develop the corridor as an economic approach to conservation and as a way of protecting the rest of the forest. And then, of course, you know, the issue which I think many of you are interested in, it's 40 gigatons of carbon sequestration, carbon retention in that forest. It's the only forest, tropical forest, that absorbs more carbon than it emits. That's not the case for the Amazon nor for Southeast Asia. So it remains a healthy forest. But it also offers, not just an incredible asset for the climate crisis and for biodiversity conservation. That too, of course, is a business model. If the carbon financing instruments can be brought to bear effectively, so that they feed into these investments that allow for the Congolese people to benefit, and for their resources to be maintained. And so that's really the future. That's where we are today. It's an incredibly exciting moment for us. The European Union has stepped up, contrary to the tendencies of the day, which is to pull back on these kinds of projects. They're committing to 100 million euros of investment into this, which will get us through the pilot phase. That pilot phase is the first 5% on a program that will bring 1 million tons of food a year from the east in a way that brings peace back to the east, to the city of Kinshasa, and will feed over half the population of Kinshasa. That alone is locally produced food that's at the moment shipped from Brazil, Europe, and South Africa. I've been told that the 60 largest ships on the ocean consume or do more climate damage than the entire vehicle cheptel of the planet. The whole issue of producing food locally is also, in addition to protecting the forest, a critical climate issue. And so 2 days ago, we produced our first drum of biodiesel. Biodiesel is not ideal, but it's a hell of a lot better than diesel. For transport, 70% less carbon emissions, but also it's locally produced, and it feeds into the local economy. And so there is this idea that within 3 years, we'll have 6 ships transporting food along the Congo River from the Virunga region to Kinshasa. A whole number of these FOBs built throughout, at least 20 built throughout Eastern Congo, producing food into these secondary industrial hubs, and extending community by community across the corridor in a way that is financially sustainable, but also creates underlying sustainability for society. So the Chinese are doing the heavy lifting. So they are building the road, which would be an asphalt road. Either we can condemn the construction of the road or we can embrace it, but try and occupy the economic space that road creates by defining how the economy grows. And that's by expanding these FOBs all the way along that corridor. And so this is it. From a much more regional perspective, I think one of the key aspects is, again, to understand, I've tried to explain the roots of conflict from a local level, in terms of how the community that we live with have experienced it. But there's also another view on it, which follows the same patterns, which is a much more macro geopolitical perspective on violence. When we were beginning the construction of the power plants, one of the big investors was the Buffett Foundation, And they were asking us to hold meetings in Dar es Salaam. We weren't so sure why, but one of the reasons it emerged was because they were interested in building the railway, which was known as the Central Corridor, from Dar es Salaam to Kigali. It turns out the Chinese were interested in the Northern Corridor, which goes from Mombasa to Nairobi to Kampala. In the end, the Chinese were faster, and they built the single gauge railway. It's now built all the way almost as far as Kampala. Of course, that has huge significance in terms of the dynamics of resource extraction in the Congo Basin. It's the issue of where do those resources go. For Rwanda, it's an existential threat. It's a small country with a large population. It doesn't have the resources to survive. This is a very serious issue for them. When the Ugandans built the road just north of the Rwandan border into Congo, which connects with the Northern Corridor, was the day the war started. And the first thing they did was to attack the town where the machines were, the bulldozers and so on, to construct that road to Goma. It's all about the resources. It's all about the power relations around those resources. It's part of the dream of having a third corridor that goes westwards, that enables us to balance out those tensions, to achieve this idea of regional integration. You know, the dream that Europe had at the end of the Second World War, of balancing out the economy across the entire region by having a third corridor that goes westwards. And so it is an important project. It goes way beyond our small team in Virunga, but it does seem to be getting enormous traction. And we're grateful that you feel a part of that. And hopefully something will come of this. I really do hope so. Thank you.